Hi, this is Jeffrey Reddick, creator of Final Destination.
Greetings, Slashaholics. This is David Bergantino, author of the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror books, the Bard's Blood horror Shakespeare books.
Hey guys, this is Jason Brooks, Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th Vengeance.
Hey, this is Slasher Pepper.
Hey everybody, it's CJ Graham, Jason, Friday the 13th Part 6.
This is William Pattison, known to Friday the 13th fans as Eric Morris.
Hi, this is Deborah Voorhees from Friday the 13th Part 5.
Hey folks, this is Adam Marcus, director of Jason Goes to Hell and Secret Santa.
Hello, kiddies. This is John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper.
Hi, this is Kane Hodder, better known as Jason from Friday the 13th, Victor Crowley from Hatchet.
And you are listening.
You're listening.
And you're listening.
And you're listening.
Just want to make sure you guys know you're listening.
You are listening.
And you are listening.
And you are lucky enough to be listening.
Okay, boils and ghouls, you are listening.
You are listening
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
The 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To 80s Slasher Librarian.
To 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian. Keep listening, or I'll kill you.
Be seen in your dream.
When I want you in my arms, when I want you, and all your charms. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream, 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 dream.
Oh.
When I feel blue in the night, and I need you to hold me tight. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream.
Just remember,
I can make you mine, taste your lips of wine, anytime, night or day. The only trouble is, gee whiz, I'm dreaming my life away. I need you so that I could die.
Hello, Slashaholics. Tonight's upload is brought to you by our patrons over on the Patreon page. That's Bonanza Jellybean, Bree, Carl Eakins, Cecilia Spears, Allison Sibe, Hawaii, Iron Alexa, Catherine McClear, Kai Antez, Ryan Woodward, Sean Campbell, and TikTok12. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel through Patreon. You guys are the reason the channel keeps going. And if anybody listening right now enjoys the content here on the 80s Slasher Librarian YouTube channel and would like to help the channel continue to go and grow for years to come, please take the time to head over to the Patreon page where you can sign up for as low as $2 to $5 per month. You help the channel keep growing because we're not able to monetize it here on YouTube because the copyright holders get all the ad revenue. So I depend on you listeners to take the time to sign up on Patreon. And I do offer some great rewards for you depending on the tier you select. Some of those rewards include early access content before it reaches YouTube, free slasher ebooks sent to you via email, free merch from the merch store, guest spots in upcoming narrations where you can voice a character in audiobooks monthly, and guest spots on the podcast, and much more. So just head over to Patreon, check it out, find the tier that's right for you to get the rewards you want and to support the channel. If you appreciate what I'm doing here on the channel, then I would greatly appreciate your support on Patreon. And enjoy tonight's upload of A Nightmare on Elm Street. A Nightmare on Elm Street, the novelization of the first film. A novel by Jeffrey Cooper. Prologue. Freddy was dead. The good people of Elm Street had seen to it that the Springwood slasher would never bother anyone ever again. 10 years had come and gone since then, and only now were the good people of Elm Street beginning to sleep peacefully at night, safe and warm in their cozy suburban bedrooms. Freddy was dead and gone, but the nightmare was just about to begin. Chapter 1. Tina woke up screaming. The covers clutched tightly in her trembling hands. "Are you all right?" asked her mother from the doorway. "Sure, Ma," whispered Tina. "It was just a bad dream." "Just a bad dream," she repeated to herself, trying very hard to believe her own words. Tina had not lived 15 years without suffering an occasional bad dream. But this dream was not like anything she had ever known before. There was something evil about this dream. It had started innocently enough. Tina was lost in a vast room full of thick, leaky pipes and pounding machinery. It was a boiler room, similar to the one at school, only it was unbelievably large, and Tina was wearing the same thin nightgown she had gone to sleep in. Despite the steam that pervaded the stifling air, she had felt chilled to the bone as she wandered aimlessly through iron doorways and along ramps and down metal ladders that seemed always to lead nowhere. And she remembered animal noises. A lamb had bleated, and Tina's heart had begun to pound furiously in her chest. What a lamb was doing in the boiler room in the first place, and why its bleating should be so terrifying, were questions Tina couldn't have answered, even if her life had depended on it. And why did she feel that it might? Then there was the fabric, a dirty piece of cloth hanging in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly it tore open with a terrible ripping noise, as 4 gleaming blades like steel fingers glittered threateningly into the murky darkness. Tina began to run, but she was thoroughly lost and didn't know which way to go. There was a horrible screeching sound as the steel blades scraped against the iron pipes like fingernails on a chalkboard, or the high-pitched whine of a dentist's drill as it digs painfully into an exposed nerve. And Tina kept running, knowing that her life depended on escape, but knowing too that ultimately there could be no escape. And then she stopped to catch her breath and wipe away the sweat that streamed down her face in hot rivulets. And for one sweet moment Tina felt safe. Perhaps, she thought, just perhaps, there might be a way out after all. And that was when the man with the razor blade fingers loomed up behind her, clawing at her nightgown with insane fury as he enfolded her in his deadly arms. It was Tina's scream that had awoken her and summoned her mother to the bedroom. "You sure you're all right?" her mother asked again, still leaning up against the door jamb. "It was just a dream," repeated Tina. "It must have been some dream." Mrs. Gray shook her head slowly from side to side as she gazed at her daughter's nightgown. Tina looked down, suddenly aware of the 4 long slashes up the middle of her favorite nightgown. "You better cut your fingernails or stop that kind of dreaming," said her mother. "One or the other." She looked at her daughter one more time and then quietly shut the door behind her. Instinctively, Tina reached back and removed the crucifix that hung on her bedroom wall. She clutched it to her heart as the old jump rope song that she had sung as a child seemed to chant itself in her brain. "That's what it reminded me of," Tina told her best friend Nancy Thompson the next morning. "That old jump rope song? Worst nightmare I ever had." The girls had just stepped out of Glen Lance's old red convertible. Glen had already taken Nancy's books as the 3 young people strode briskly toward the old high school building. "As a matter of fact," said Nancy, "I had a bad dream last night myself." Tina was about to ask Nancy about her dream when Rod Lane trotted up from behind and draped his right arm over her shoulders. "I had a hard-on this morning when I woke up, Tina," he said. "Had your name written all over it." Tina looked at the boy and shrugged off his arm. "There's 4 letters in my name, Rod," she said. "How could there be room on your joint for 4 letters?" Nancy and Glen laughed out loud. Despite Tina's flip attitude toward the boy, Nancy knew that her friend really liked him. There always seemed to be an almost tangible sexual tension in the air whenever Tina and Rod were together, and the fact that Tina's mother couldn't stand the boy only added to his appeal. Rod had never looked like the rest of them, in his heavy boots and his black leather jacket, and he had a vulgar way of expressing himself that Nancy sometimes found a little embarrassing. Still, she knew that he was basically a good person, and she was confident that someday Tina Gray would be known as the girl who finally tamed the infamous Rod Lane. Rod, on the other hand, would never be known for the brilliance of his chivalry. "Hey!" he yelled as Tina, Nancy, and Glen strode off without him. "Up yours with the twirling lawn mower!" "Rod says the sweetest things," said Tina as the boy took off across the lawn. "He's nuts about you," said Nancy, smiling at her friend. "Yeah, nuts. Anyway, I'm too tired to worry about it. I couldn't get back to sleep at all last night." Tina paused and looked at Nancy. "So what did you dream?" "Forget it," said Nancy. She felt herself shudder as she recalled the nightmare that had kept her up most of the night. "The point is, everybody has nightmares once in a while. It's no biggie." The next time you have one," suggested Glen, "just tell yourself that that's all it is, right while you're having it. Once you do that, you wake up right away." He looked at Nancy and shrugged. "At least it works for me." They had just reached the steps in front of Springwood High when the first bell began to ring. Glen quickly kissed Nancy on the cheek and dashed off to his first class. "Hey!" yelled Tina as the boy took off, climbing 2 steps at a time. "Did you have a nightmare too?" But Glen was gone. Tina turned back to Nancy and sighed deeply. "Maybe we're going to have an earthquake or something. They say things get really weird before an earthquake." But there was no earthquake, and Tina was still thinking about her dream when she got home from school that afternoon. It didn't make her feel any better to learn that her mother was going to be spending the next couple of nights out of town with her current boyfriend. The first thing Tina did was invite Nancy to spend the night at her house. Neither girl objected when Glen decided to tag along. "I'm glad you could stay over," said Tina when her friends arrived. "When my mom said she was taking off for 2 days, I almost died." "No problem," said Nancy, giving her friend's arm a reassuring squeeze. "Nancy and Glen to the rescue." The girls settled themselves on the couch, and Glen announced that he had to call home. "I can't believe his mother is letting him stay over here," said Tina. "Well," said Nancy with a mischievous smile, "she isn't exactly." The girls watched as Glen inserted a cassette into the oversized tape player he had placed on the table next to the telephone. "I've got this cousin who lives near the airport," he explained while he waited for his mother to pick up the phone. "So I borrowed this sound effects tape. Hello, Mom?" He pushed a button on the tape player, and the sound of a 747 coming in for a landing suddenly filled the room. "Yeah, I'm out at Barry's," he said. He grinned at the girls, and Nancy put a hand over Tina's mouth to stop her from laughing. "Yeah, noisy as usual. Glad we don't live here. What? Oh, Aunt Eunice says hello." The roar of the jet was overwhelming now, as if Glen were standing in the middle of the runway. "I'll call you in the morning," he shouted, his lips pressed up against the mouthpiece. "Don't worry, Suddenly the tape was silent. Then a new roaring began, but this time it was the roar of stock cars screeching at top speed around a racetrack. "I'm not sure," said Glen into the telephone, struggling to improvise. "I think some kids are drag racing outside." Then the sound effects changed again. There was a screech of brakes, a blood-curdling scream, and the sound of a horrible collision. Nancy jumped up from the couch and tried to turn off the tape recorder, but her fingers found the fast-forward instead. "I gotta go, Mom," said Glen, glaring at Tina, as she dissolved into laughter on the couch. "I think there's been an accident out front." Meanwhile, Nancy had managed to turn the machine back on, but now they were in the middle of a full-scale war, complete with chattering machine guns and exploding bombs. "Right!" shouted Glen. "I'll call the police." No, just some neighbors having a fight, I guess." "I'm fine, Mom." No, I'll call you in the morning." At last, Nancy found the stop button, and the room was filled with blessed silence. "Worked like a charm," said Nancy as she and Tina exploded with laughter. An hour later, Tina, Nancy, and Glen were relaxing in front of a cozy fire and listening to soft music on the stereo. "Maybe we should call Rod and ask him over," said Nancy as she snuggled up next to Glen on the couch. "Rod and I are through," said Tina. She sat back and propped her feet up on the coffee table. "He's too much of a maniac." "He should join the Marines," said Glen. "Maybe they could make something out of him, like a hand grenade." Tina laughed. "See," said Nancy. "You're forgetting the bad dream already. Didn't I tell you?" Tina shook her head sadly, the smile gone from her face. "All day long I've been seeing that guy's weird face," she said, "and I keep hearing those fingernails." "Fingernails?" echoed Nancy, staring at her friend in amazement. "It's so strange that you're saying that. It made me remember the dream I had last night." "What did you dream, Nancy?" "I dreamed about this guy in a dirty red and green sweater." Nancy suddenly felt very uncomfortable. "And he had these fingernails that he scraped along things. Actually, they were more like knives or something, like he'd made them himself. Anyway, they made this horrible screeching noise." Nancy imitated the chilling sound of metal scraping against metal, and Tina sat up straight in her chair. "You dreamed about the same creep I did?" she said. "That's impossible," said Glen as the two girls stared at each other. "Two people can't—" He stopped abruptly and looked out the window. "What is it?" whispered Tina. "Nothing," said Glen. "There's somebody out there." "I didn't hear anything," said Nancy. And then they all heard it, the thin, sharp sound of something scraping against the house, just outside the window. "Jesus!" whispered Tina. It was Glen who made the first move. He unlocked the door and stepped out into the darkness. "I'm going to punch out your ugly lights, whoever you are," he announced, but the only answer was a slight rustling in the bushes. Glen promptly turned around and headed back toward the house, but the two girls prodded him further into the darkness. "It's only a stupid cat," he said a little more loudly than necessary as he edged slowly toward the bushes. He stopped in his tracks as the unmistakable scraping sound again disturbed the silence of the night. "Kitty, kitty," said Glen, taking a few cautious steps forward. "Chow, chow, chow?" There was no answer, but complete and utter silence. Glen turned toward the girls with a shrug. He was about to speak when a large figure leaped out from behind a bush and threw him to the ground with a terrible shout. Tina turned to run for help when she recognized the hulking figure of Rod Lane. "And it's number 36, the boy said, rising quickly to his feet, "bringing Lance down just 3 yards from the goal with a brilliant tackle, and the fans go wild." Rod grinned wildly as he threw his arm around Tina's shoulders. "What the hell are you doing here?" asked Tina. "I come to make up," said Rod. He glanced toward the house. "Your ma home?" "Of course," the girl lied. She noticed the metal object in Rod's right hand. "What's that?" Rod held up a rusty old hand rake he had found lying in the yard and scraped it slowly against the side of the house. Tina winced as she heard the horrible screeching noise that had first attracted Glen's attention. "Intense, huh?" said Rod, tossing the rake aside. "So what's happening? An orgy or something?" "Maybe a funeral, you jerk," said Glen. He glared furiously at the boy who had just scared and humiliated him in front of the girls. Rod turned to Glen sharply, and a switchblade knife suddenly appeared in his hand. Without a moment's hesitation, Nancy stepped between the two boys. "It's a sleepover date," she told Rod. "Just Tina and me. Glen was just leaving." Rod stared at Glen for a few long seconds before closing the knife and slipping it back into his jacket pocket. Glen breathed a sigh of relief as Rod threw his arm around Tina again and laughed. "You see his face?" he said, grinning as if he had just pulled off a brilliant practical joke. Then he glanced at the house again and sized up the situation. "Your ma ain't home, is she?" Without waiting for an answer, he took Tina by the arm and began dragging her toward the house. "Me and Tina got stuff to discuss," he said. "We got her mother's bed, you two got the rest." Nancy waited uncertainly for a few seconds and then turned to Glen. "We should get out of here," she said. Before Glen could reply, Tina reappeared at the front door. The top buttons of her blouse were already undone. "You guys are hanging around, right?" she said. "Don't leave me alone with this lunatic." Nancy watched as her friend disappeared back into the house. She knew Tina really wanted to spend the night with Rod, and yet... "So we'll guard her together," said Glen, interrupting her thoughts. "Through the night." Nancy looked at Glen and nodded. "We're here for Tina, not for ourselves," she said. "Okay?" In other words, Glen thought as he nodded in agreement, I'm sleeping on the couch. Sometimes he wished that Nancy could be a little more like her friend Tina. Why was she so bothered by a stupid nightmare anyway? He asked as they began walking back towards the house. "Because it was scary, that's all. Don't you think it's weird both of us dreaming about the same guy?" Glen looked away, and Nancy felt a sudden chill. "You had a dream last night too, didn't you, Glen?" Glen shrugged his shoulders. "I never remember my dreams," he said. "All I know is my mom's going to kill me when she does the wash. I practically ripped my sheet in half." Nancy wanted to continue the conversation, but it was getting late, and she was suddenly feeling very tired. She went inside with Glen and kissed him good night. Then she locked herself in Tina's bedroom, leaving Glen to make himself as comfortable as possible on the living room sofa. Glen was feeling tired too, and he might have fallen asleep immediately if it weren't for the sounds of passionate love-making that emanated from Tina's mother's bedroom. Glen couldn't help thinking about Rod and Tina furiously copulating upstairs while he and Nancy spent the night in separate rooms. "Morality sucks," he said softly. Then he pulled the covers up over his head and tried to get some sleep. Tina had a reputation for being fast. It wasn't something she was especially proud of, but it wasn't anything she lost sleep over either. Tina knew she didn't really deserve her reputation. Sure, she had slept with a few boys, but that didn't mean she was some kind of pushover. She liked sex, and she knew how to protect herself. If she wanted to fool around once in a while, Tina figured it was nobody's damn business but her own. "I knew there was something about you I liked," she said, as she snuggled closer to Rod in her mother's bed that night. "You feel better now, right?" he asked with a satisfied grin. "Jungle Man fixed Jane," said Tina. Rod was definitely a little rough around the edges, but there was a vulnerable side to the boy that really turned Tina on. "No more fights?" said Rod, his hand resting on Tina's small breast. "No more fights," she agreed, feeling very sleepy and content. She thought about Nancy sleeping alone across the hall. It was hard for Tina to understand how her best friend could go out with a nice boy like Glen for so long without wanting to go all the way. "Good night," said Rod, yawning loudly as he pulled the cover over his head. "No more nightmares for either of us, then." Suddenly, Tina felt a cold chill race down her spine. "When did you have a nightmare?" she asked. "Guys have nightmares too," said Rod. "You girls don't exactly corner the market on dreams and nightmares." Tina stared at the unmoving figure beside her for a moment and then took a deep breath. She was glad to be here with Rod, and she wasn't going to let some dumb nightmare ruin things for her. Besides, she felt safe with Rod at her side. She watched him for a moment as he slept and then turned out the light. "Tonight, I'm finally going to get a good night's sleep," she thought, "even if it kills me." She had not been asleep long when she heard the noise. At first she thought it was just the faucet dripping. She tried not to pay attention, but the pinging noises were too loud and too persistent to be ignored. "Rod," she whispered, but the boy only snored steadily beside her. She sat up in bed, wondering how Rod could sleep through all the racket. There was another ping, and Tina realized it was coming from outside. She stepped into her slippers and reached the window in time to see a pebble bounce off the glass. "Jesus," she whispered. It was windy out, and the trees were blowing wildly in the darkness. Suddenly, a large stone smashed into the glass, startling Tina as a thin and ragged crack appeared inside the window pane. "Somebody threw that," thought Tina, suddenly furious at whoever was out there, disturbing her precious sleep. Without thinking, she dashed down the stairs and stepped out into the darkness. "Who are you?" she demanded. For a moment she considered going back inside to get her robe, but something seemed to be compelling her to step farther into the blackness instead. Then she was at the gate, stepping outside before turning around to look at the house. Only she couldn't see the familiar old house on Elm Street anymore. Instead, she seemed to be in an alley that she vaguely remembered seeing before in a dream. It was completely quiet now, except for the rushing of the wind. Then the metal lid of a trash can came clattering down the alley, crashing to a halt at Tina's feet. She stared at the lid for a moment and took a deep breath to calm herself. She was still assuring herself that everything was all right when she heard the horrible scraping of metal on cinder block. And there in the darkness she saw the man from her nightmare, his steel finger knives raising bright yellow sparks as they screeched horribly along the alley wall. Tina turned, looking for a place. She was about to make a break for the end of the alley when the horrible man suddenly extended his long, bony arms along the full length of the narrow alleyway, cutting off the girl's only escape route. "Oh, God," she whispered.
"This is God,"
replied the man hoarsely, his twisted mouth grinning obscenely as he clicked his razor-sharp blades in Tina's face. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been a little bonus surprise upload. The first chapter of A Nightmare on Elm Street, the novelization of the first movie, written by Jeffrey Cooper. This is going to be the book that I'm going to alternate uploads between this and Child's Play 2. Thought you guys might enjoy this. Both of these books are something I've been looking forward to reading for a while, so I thought this was the perfect time to alternate. Because on the Child's Play 2 uploads, I gotta cut and paste the other voice actors' voices in for certain characters, and this way, every other day, I can do a little bit of an easier upload, and also put out 2 amazing audiobooks from great novelizations for you guys at the same time. And I know there's been a lot of people that have asked me to do the novelizations of the Elm Street movies, so I thought this was as good a time as any to start them. This book is actually parts 1, 2, and 3 all in the same book, but I'm going to do them separately. Like, I'm going to go ahead and put out the uploads of the chapters of the part of the book that is just the novelization of the first movie now. Then maybe on the next rotation, I'll do Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, and then Dream Warriors later on. I want to split it up and stretch it out a little bit. Hope you guys appreciate that, because I have my rotation pretty much Freddy, Jason, Michael, Final Destination, Rinse, Repeat. We're putting Chucky into the rotation now. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I enjoyed putting out the prologue in Chapter 1 of this novelization of the first Elm Street movie. Hope you guys are enjoying it too. Let me know in the comment section if you're excited about this little surprise upload tonight. And then I'm going to be alternating the uploads between this and Child's Play 2. Until both of them are finished, and then I'll move on to the next book. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
pleasant dreams!